Good evening, everybody. Hi. Thank you for coming to tonight's event. My name is Luke Andreso, and I'm an intern here at the Jefferson. And it is my pleasure to kick off tonight's event. And I'm here to do three things: go over some housekeeping notes, tell you about some upcoming Jefferson events, and finally introduce tonight's first presenter. But first, some housekeeping. If you need assistance during the event, please feel free to find me or one of our volunteers, and we'll be happy to help you. Some reminders for the question and answer portion. Please raise your hand and be called on and speak into the microphone, which will be brought to you. And please try to keep your questions brief and concise, and try to refrain from offering lengthy statements. Now on to some upcoming events. Monday at noon, Olivia Heibach will take stage at the Jefferson to present Together We Welcome Crafting Erie's Inclusive Future. Then Tuesday at 7 p.m., Lavia Brockman will be at the Jefferson again to present From the Ground Up, How Local Efforts Drive Economic Growth. Finally, Wednesday at 6 p.m., Dr. Lena Sursko-Harned will deliver a lecture at the Harbor Creek Township building titled Ukraine and Russia, Where Are We Now and Where Are We Headed? Lastly, I would like to introduce you to our first presenter tonight. Timothy Bruno is Chief of the Office of the Great Lakes at the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, where he oversees water quality, usage, and watershed initiatives. He represents Pennsylvania on the Great Lakes Commission and serves on several binational governance bodies, including the Great Lakes Executive Committee. And Bruno holds a degree in political science and environmental health and engineering from Gannon University, and brings deep expertise in environmental policy and regional coordination. Without a further ado, let's welcome Tim Bruno.
So I'm minor in blues and jazz, I guess. No, thank you. And what a nice night for us to get together, and I really appreciate you all coming out to talk a little bit about the history of blues and jazz in the Erie area. How it progressed throughout the decades, the origination of this really, really special festival that John Vanco was the architect of, and how it's been going on since 1992. And then, with our friends here from WQLN, we have two great radio hosts here that are going to be telling us about how they keep that vision alive. But, the first portion, we're going to have three different parts tonight. And the first portion is going to be about a history of the Pope Hotel. And if you're not familiar with this, you're going to learn a lot about the history of blues and jazz inside of Erie, African-American history. And it's a special pleasure to introduce a fellow blues and jazz board member, Tanya Teglo. And Tanya is an author, a historian, and she specializes in African-American history. She's written articles for many academic journals, including Nat D. Williams, Beale Street Historian for the West Tennessee Historical Society papers, as well as WDIA and the Black Press, a powerful partnership for the Tennessee Historical Quarterly. Tanya has also spent many years serving the disabled community, having been a member of various committees and work groups in Pennsylvania government dealing with disability policy. In addition to writing and research, she has taken an active role in assisting her alma mater, Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania, in enhancing its disability services. And so, without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Tanya, and we will commence with her presentation.
Hey, how's everybody doing out there tonight? Good. Glad to hear it. My presentation is going to center around, like Tim said, the Pope Hotel, but we've got a little bit of background to cover before that. So if we could get to the next slide. This is just to show you some of the different types of music that Erie has been involved with over the years. You have blues, jazz, orchestra, big band, even Elvis impersonators. Okay, next slide. And then we have the Pope Hotel, which is actually known as Erie's Harlem. And it was established by William Pope and his wife Jessie. And then Ernest Pope took over Ernest Wright took over after the Popes. And these are just some old photographs of what the Pope Hotel looked like. And there's Ernest Wright Sr. Next slide. And at the Pope Hotel, they had several African-American artists come to play, like nationally known artists like Aretha Franklin, Ray Charles, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Pearl Bailey. And there was many more. And what is interesting about this is because a lot of times when African American artists came through Erie, they couldn't stay at the other hotels because of unofficial, let's say, segregation policies. So they would come to the Pope Hotel and they would play when they got there. B.B. King even said that he couldn't remember the name of the place, but he knew it was very special because he couldn't stay anywhere else, and he played his heart out there, and he was forever thankful to the Pope Hotel for being able to play there. Next slide. These are some of the advertisements I found for the Pope Hotel inside the Erie Times, and some of these advertisements, as I looked through them, they would say things like that they would name a group, and then they would say that the tan whatever, and that word tan signified the first time somebody thought of the Black is Beautiful campaign, because they wanted to advertise that they had African American artists. Next, go back one, please. Okay, and they had dancers, musicians, and comedians all come, and a lot of times they did two acts per night at least. And then, next slide. As you'll see, the Pope Hotel was involved in a lot of community outreach too, and they tried to advertise national acts when they would come to Erie and play, and they would do things to support the veterans. They would have veterans meetings every so often. I would see them in the newspaper, and then they would also, like, if there was a public health crisis, like at one point there was one for venereal disease, and they had a special film shown at the Pope Hotel called One Step, and that let people know what to do about a health crisis such as venereal disease. But there was a lot more that they did in terms of community activism. They even supported a basketball team at one particular point, because it was very important for these clubs like the Pope Hotel that existed to have a connection with the African American community, so that they could foster an identity that they wanted to see people be able to have and connect with. Next slide. This is not to say, though, that the Pope Hotel didn't go through some hard times. Like they had a fire, and it almost burned it completely down, because there was like $9,000 worth of damage, and they had some licensing issues with liquor with the government during prohibition, and the owners would have to fight to maintain their liquor license. And the Pope Hotel, just like Beale Street in Memphis, for as historic as it is and as historic as it was, there was also a lot of violence that would occur. In Memphis, Tennessee, on Beale Street, they used to say it wasn't a Saturday night until someone got killed. Well, the violence wasn't quite that bad with the Pope Hotel, but they did have a lot of stabbings and some shootings and a lot of like investigations going on by the police that hurt their business and slowed it down. And by the 50s, a big problem was entertainers wanted more money to play, and people in Erie just didn't have that kind of money or those kind of finances, so that really hurt the Pope Hotel. But the guy that really knows about the Pope Hotel and can tell you much more about its history than I is John Vanco, and he's up next.
Tanya's covered pretty well in broad strokes. Many of the musicians that appeared who stayed at the Pope Hotel didn't perform at the Pope Hotel. They performed in larger venues all over the city, at theaters, at Waldemere, and other outdoor venues in the summer. And but as she mentioned, they had no choice about where they were going to stay if they wanted to have a hotel room for the night. The Pope Hotel was still going. I worked at the newspaper in 1968, and it was just half a block from the newspaper. So I went there 4 or 5 times. If I went there with a black friend, it was fine. If I went with a couple of other friends, a couple of other young white guys, I didn't get such a good reception, which was quite understandable. But there's a ton of history attached to it, and I'm fortunate to have acquired through happenstance the pictures that were on the wall at the Pope Hotel when they tore it down. They threw them in a dumpster, and an antique dealer was on his way back from lunch to the antique shop. But it was at that time, it was at 14th and State, and he saw these pictures in the dumpster and pulled them out. And so I heard about them. A friend called me and said, "We won't believe what's at this antique shop." And so I went over and I bought them. And so I brought a half a dozen examples or so of some of the things that were on the wall there. And Mr. Wright, who succeeded the popes in owning the hotel, he was the guy who owned it when I went there. He also owned the Cleveland Buckeyes, who were the world champions for the Negro League in 1944 and 1945, as well as other accomplishments. And so he was connected to all the Negro League owners and knew a lot of the players. And it's a fascinating glimpse into Erie's history from an African-American cultural perspective. And thanks, Tanya. And she's going to do more on this. She's going to publish something of real note.
Hopefully, yes.
Tanya, can you talk a little bit more about how it was a cultural center and why it was so important to the African American community to have a place like the hotel?
Because when you're not accepted by other members of society, and there's a place like the Pope Hotel for you to go where you could basically say, hey, we need to have a meeting in here for the veterans, or we need to have a meeting in here and show this film, or we need to. It was a way to get things. It was a way to get things done, much like WDIA radio did in Memphis. It served as that community bulletin board, so to speak, that without it you wouldn't have had it otherwise.
Right, because this, like society around it, did not provide those same types of
Right.
services.
Exactly. And I haven't researched Erie newspapers that much to know if they had an African American newspaper or not. But when you don't have something like that, getting it into a public place is probably your next best bet that you could do. So that's why places like the Pope Hotel become so important, because they were that little bit of a mecca that you needed to have for that community to be able to connect with each other on different levels.
Did you see any of the stories about? The hotel was a place where African Americans could go, and they could talk to each other. They could hear music that they sang, lyrics that made sense to them, but also apparently it was like a fantastic place to eat that served food that many of those folks who had come up from the South were accustomed to, right? Things like just good soul food, fried chicken, smothered greens, those types of things. Did you read anything about those?
I didn't catch those, no, but that doesn't mean they weren't there though. But it didn't say that too much in the newspaper articles that I read. It said a lot about baseball and a lot about the Negro League that I had no idea even really existed. That kind of caught me more sometimes than the music stuff did, because I just found it so interesting. I was like, whoa, I did not know all of this. But when you think about it, a lot of what I was looking at was before 1947, I think it was, when Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. So yeah, it was a real treat reading about that too.
Yeah, I think when you look at the other, like European cultures that came here, that have festivals, Polish festival, Italian festival, these places that shared their customs, their foods, the thing that made them, together. The hotel really kind of served that same type of purpose to bring people together. I thought it was really neat.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's important to remember about landmarks like that. Not just, oh, it was a bar that played some music. Well, you got to really look at the inner picture of it to really grasp and really get what it all really meant. And I think it's sad today when you think about the older forms of media like radio and everything and what it did for this country. And when you look at what's going on with, I shouldn't do this, but different budget cuts and stuff, we're going to be missing a big part of our culture pretty soon, because we're not going to have as much access to things as we do now. And what you do here is going to be so one-sided, it's going to be hard for people to develop a way to think about their own lives and their culture and what they want to do and what they can do. And I think it's our job to try to preserve as much of this history as we can now, because it's just not going to be here.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, that's a heavy point. It's also a pretty unbelievable segue talking about our history, right? And, you know, what we've done over the years and how it's kind of developing into where we are now and what we do in the future. But it's, you know, it behooves us to make sure that we preserve that for our children and for our grandchildren. And places like public radio and public television do that. And you know, when faced with, you know, trials, you have to go forward. You have to find new ways to get messages out. And no doubt that will happen. So
Yes.
thank you, Tanya.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Because the man to my left really, you know, needs no introduction. If you're from Erie, you probably know who he is. It's my friend John Vanco, and you know, I'll just give a few items about his illustrious career at the Erie Arts Museum, and he served as director and curator for the Erie Art Museum. It was first known as the Erie Art Center from 1968 until his retirement in 2017. And he oversaw major expansions in making the place more professional and really bringing quality exhibits to the museum. You know, under his guidance, the museum integrated 5 historic buildings into a single LEED environmental certification facility in 2010. And he also curated over 500 exhibits. He boosted public engagement through events like Midday Art Break and championed folk craft and contemporary forms. And if you're in the environmental sector, you know that John is as big an advocate for environmental issues and our earth around us than he is for the art forms. And so for all of those, we are certainly grateful. But I am even more grateful because he provided a heck of a lot of spiritual guidance in this next topic here that we're going to talk about, and that's the Erie Blues and Jazz Festival. And so what I'd like to do over this second part to our presentation tonight is to engage with John in just a series of questions about how the festival originated and what it looked like throughout the years. Because some of these I just have not asked him yet, because as of last year, we started with a new board of directors for the Erie Arts and Music Festival, which produces the Blues and Jazz Festival. And so I get to hear some of the history behind it and maybe try to make sense of what we're doing right now. So with that, I think I'm going to join John down here. All right, you ready for this?
I'm ready.
I literally just showed him the questions right before we started. No, and so for the audience, can you tell them a little bit about how you came back to Erie and started at the Erie Arts Center, and then, you know, how that became the Arts Museum?
Yeah, sure. First, I want to add thanks to Tanya for her work, and point out that kind of building on what the last thing that she was talking about, how important as community leaders both the popes and the Wrights were in this community. That shouldn't be underestimated. But at any rate, yeah, I lived in New York in most of 1967, and I came back in 1968 to work at the Erie Times News. It was the Erie Daily Times at the time. There were still 2 newspapers when I worked there, both of them published by the same people, but the Erie Morning News and the Erie Daily Times, and we competed with one another. And knowing that I had an art history degree, they leaned on me to write the art column for the newspaper. And so I got to meet all the people in the visual arts community, which was pretty small, actually. There wasn't a lot going on. it was a stretch to find something to write about every week. But in November of 1968, the board of the Art Club of Erie, which had acquired a building on West 6th Street and dubbed the building the Art Center of Erie. And they decided that they were ready to hire a director. And my city editor came to me and said, I know I'm going to regret this, but they're looking to hire somebody at the art club. And I thought, well, my art history degree actually going to work out. And I took the job. And over the years, tried to build up the programming. We eventually, in the 80s, 82, we moved over and acquired what we now think of as the Erie Art Museum. And shortly thereafter, other real estate on that block. And build it into something like it is today. At various points, I was approached by other institutions, wondering if I wanted to apply for a job elsewhere. But this is where I'm from. This is where my family is. I didn't really want to leave Erie. And I felt, well, I'm already in charge of this institution. I had to work with it, but I could do more things that would appeal to me, and I think at the same time to our audience, and serve the institution and the community as well as myself. And I went to New York frequently at this time in the 70s and 80s, and I frequently would go to the Loft performances in Soho. And I remember one rainy night, I went to a show that was Oliver Lake and Leroy Jenkins, and there was 15 people at this show. I thought, whoa, I can see these guys with 15 people. I bet I could get 50 people in Erie. and that's really where I started. And in fact, Leroy Jenkins was the first artist that I presented in what came to be known as the Contemporary Music Series at the Art Museum. And I moved it around to lots of different locations for a while.
That was a really cool space.
Yeah, well, I did it on what is now PACA. We developed that building. We were the first ones to make that into an art place. And I had a theater there, and one of the reason I built the theater is so I could present some music. And then we eventually moved it over to what the annex at the what was called the annex at the art museum, and presented a lot of music during that time. And after a decade or so of doing that, one of my board members came to me one day and said, "Hey, we really need to have a jazz festival." And it was Jim Spiegel, who was a realtor here in Erie, and it was also a jazz fan. And I frankly wasn't interested in doing a jazz festival. I liked the small, intimate performances that we were able to present, both at the Art Museum and at the other sites around the community. And so, he had to work on me for a while to convince me. And
What did he tell you?
well,
How did he sell you on this
Well, he
concept?
said, "Listen, I'll help you raise the money, and he'd already, of course, talked to the mayor, and Joyce was she was up for it, and so and he brought in other supporters. Tom Doolin was at which bank it was, one of the, no, before that. Yeah, before that. And at any rate, they did in fact help me put together that first one, and Jim helped me put together several after that. But it from the beginning, my goal was to make these what I knew were going to be big events, although I really didn't anticipate as big as the festival had gotten to be, to make them as intimate as possible and as friendly as possible in a way that a lot of the big music shows that you go to aren't. They're not friendly. There's a atmosphere of enclosure and that isn't the spirit that I was looking for from a thing. But we were able to make even the first festival, and it was one day, the first time, and I needed an artist who was a blues and jazz artist, and amazingly, I was able to get Charles Brown to appear. And you may not ring a bell with a lot of you, but you've all heard Charles Brown's music, especially his Christmas tunes, which are on the radio every year. But a wonderful, amazing artist and gentleman, and that really loosened me up. The idea that I could find and present these great artists that I had such great respect for, and still going.
Can you talk a little bit about the art forms in general, the music forms of blues and jazz, and how you integrated that into the concept of the festival? Because we come from a point where we want to increase interaction between people who look differently than us. When they come to August 2nd and 3rd down in Frontier Park, they are going to be around people who are Erie community. And our community doesn't always interact between white and black or Hispanic or other races. And how did you include that as a
Well, that
purposeful
was
thing?
really important right from the beginning. And Mary Alice Brown was a big part of that in bringing the African American community to the festival and engaging us with other performers. And it was important. It was important to all of us that we have that aspect of it. That this is a celebration of African American music, and as we came to define it, jazz and blues and its offshoots, which is most of American music, and the music of the African diaspora, which has expression all over the world and all kinds of flavors, became the focus of the festival and remains that to this day.
So you retired from the Erie Art Museum in 2017, and that kind of corresponded with kind of looking forward to what the Blues and Jazz Festival would look like in the future.
Yeah. As part of my retirement, I took a couple of years to prepare for retirement and thought about all the things that we're gonna change, and what did we have to do to keep the things going that I thought should keep going, including the festival. it didn't seem fair or wise to ask that the next director of the art museum run a music festival. It doesn't make any sense across the board. So I decided that was one thing that was going to have to spin off. Like we had the clay studio, the clay space studio at what is now PACA, and we'd had that for 30 some years, and we spun that off. You got the artists there to take it over, and so I tried to divest the museum of some of the individual programs that we had developed that were still part of the art museum, but it wasn't necessary that they remain part of the art museum. So we formed, I went to the Arts Council, and together with the new director at that point, Amanda Sissom, we determined to spin the festival off from the Art Museum to form a separate 501c3 corporation to run it. And that's what we did. That's been 5-6 years ago now.
And that brings us up almost to today. And one thing that, I found how resilient the festival is during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that presented a unique challenge when we couldn't get together in person. Kind of what was the response to the folks who were putting that together and you as to how to bring that to people in a time like that?
Yeah, that was a good one. I don't know if you all had the same response as I did, but I suspect that you'll know what I'm talking about when I say that the pandemic left us unable to think. Because you couldn't make any plans, because you didn't know what was going to happen next. And it was very discombobulating. And so we talked about what we might be able to do to continue the festival. And I probably wouldn't have come up with anything if it hadn't been for Tom New coming to me and say, hey, how'd you like to do the festival on television? And it was not something that I had thought about, and certainly I'd never produced an 8-hour-long television show before. But that's what we did. We had to work with the health department. We had to promise that we wouldn't have more than 25 people together at a time. And we took over the little stage that they use for Sounds Around Town up at WQLN. And at the time that we had formed the new version of the festival, we tried to add more and more different artists, both visual artists and dancers and so forth. And so we were working with a wide community of artists, from dancers to poets to painters and a whole variety of other artists. And so we teamed up artists with unlikely pairs and had them work with one another to develop what they were going to do, and also then to talk to one another, and in a way that we could fill some time on television. And so we did it as a, and it was so good. It was such a relief to me personally that I could actually think, I'd focus on something and do something and know that it was going to happen. And it was a challenge to do it, of course, also. But
I don't know. I think it brought a sense of normalcy
It did.
to people, and we
We
did disobey some mask rules that day in my backyard, where we actually we live streamed it and we projected it onto a projector screen, and we had about 15 of our closest friends come up and celebrate blues and jazz because we couldn't do it together in Frontier Park. And so, like, I think it was an important piece of normalcy during a time where things just weren't so normal.
Oh, I didn't know you do that, but a lot of other people told me the same story.
I think we won the picture at my house. Well, that brings us up to the year without a festival, and that happened in 2023. That's due to a series of circumstances, from a large major sponsor pulling out to the ability to just not make the budget that year. It didn't happen, but what that did do is inspire a whole new group of people to get involved. And I was one of those folks who came together and said, we just cannot let this happen again. This is something that's so important to our summers, our seasonality here in Erie, our ability to come together as a community, that we need to make sure that happens. And so I joined the board in 2023 along with Tanya and a whole host of other people, and we were able to really bring it back last year, and we focused on organization. And you kind of heard what I do for a day job. Those are the types of things that I do: organizational stuff, governance, board work, and so those things are easy for me to do. But some of the other stuff is just not so easy. Things like we have our treasurer in room, Matt Leibowitz. We have Stephen Engro, who works on marketing and communications. And so we really bring all of those pieces to the puzzle together, and we work as one, and try to do a little honor to the legacy that John has brought on. So in 24, we got a new board of directors. We brought the festival back, and now in 2025, we're really kind of focusing on making sure that we retain our values. What that feels like. I think people would demand it here in Erie, that the festival looks and feels the same, but also introduce new creative types of aspects to it. And so we have a committed board and staff. You can see the list of board members we have here. But also we hired 2 new individuals to help us produce this show. And they are fantastic. Maria Gangemi, who had for several years did Celebrate Erie, but is also just steeped in production and audio and performance. She knows her stuff, and she has just a tremendous amount of energy to put this on. So she's been booking the bands and making sure that the stages are there, and working with our media partners like WQLN and Community Access Media to make sure that all of those things are integrated. So not only do we have a great time in the park, but those who can't make it outside of their homes are able to experience that too through live streaming. And Alexa Frandina Brown, she's just bringing fresh ideas to the making sure that we're organized in terms of vendors. We have over 10 food and beverage vendors this year. And we have close to 20 artisans, including a whole host of vendors from Erie's Black Wall Street, who will bring all sorts of different crafts for people to look at and purchase. And so this year, in the past, there's been the main stage, which is in the bayfront portion of the Frontier Park. And there has been stages in the past on the other side of Cascade Creek, the portion that's closer to the Leaf Building. And we really wanted to make sure that we brought that area along a little bit more this year. And so we have an additional stage there this year that is almost the size as last year's main stage. And it is fully booked with local talent. So local musicians are going to be there playing throughout the day on both days. There will be an artisan village, which is sponsored by Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority. The stage itself and the talent there is sponsored by the Plastic Group and Harmony and Blessings Music Series. And it's just going to be a place where people can go if they don't want the barrage of the main stage and they want to just have, a singer-songwriter, poetry, that type of thing that's on the second stage. They can do that and kind of find someplace else to go. I mentioned that we're going to be live streaming this year from CAM and WQLN. And I encourage you to come down to the park. There's nothing like the atmosphere and environment around the park. But if you can't make it out, or say you're out of town and you want to be part of blues and jazz, you're able to do that. And so you'll be able to listen into WQLN on the radio or stream it on the internet, or you'll be able to tune into CAM also on their local channels here to see the music. And so here are some of our major sponsors, and I would be remiss not to mention them because they really help put up a large portion of the money, but they don't put up all of it. We have a lot of donors, and they range from $5 to $10, the whole way up to $20,000. The Fulton Athletic Club, which is a social club on the east side of town, they have been just hardcore supporters over the last 2 years. The Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority has given us several grants over the last 2 years to make sure that we're solid with our programming. Erie Community Foundation this year became a major sponsor. And I mentioned the Plastic Group and Harmony and Blessings. But Friends of the Festival, these are some of the donations that are still sizable. You have the Erie Arts and Culture, you have Kevin and Susan O'Connell, South Erie Turners, which is another social organization, Cascade Park Club, Jerry Griffith, who is a private individual, does not even live in Erie anymore and still supports the festival because he loves it so much, and he's coming back from California this year to see it. PNC Bank, Jason Clem, Slate and Copper. But Epic Web Studios and the Erie Reader are also, in addition to WQL and CAM, really big supporters and help us out in a multitude of ways. And so, this is all about the People's Fest. And then it's called that informally because it's about all of us, the people. And we have so many volunteers and friends that help do that. So with that, we're running just a little bit behind here, but I want to introduce two of our on-air friends and personalities here that we're lucky to have here tonight. The first is Rob Hoff, and he's the host of JazzFlight on WQLN, which many of you probably listen to like I do. Rob grew up on Jane Street in Greenwich Village, just a few blocks from the Village Vanguard. And Rob's first experiences in radio date to his years as a graduate student when he had the opportunity to host a late-night jazz program for Minnesota Public Radio. Rob continued broadcasting jazz on air when WQLN Radio signed on in 1973, and he witnessed the evolution of jazz tradition over the last 40-plus years. And he's able to share those and the best of this art with the JazzFlight listeners. And Gary Finney, who's the host of the third set, as a teenage musician, Gary was afforded the opportunity to perform everything from Dvorak to Jimi Hendrix and Neil Hefti. So that's quite a spectrum, which is not unlike me, I will say. I listen to a spectrum of music. Listening to rock and roll was Gary's passion, though, and jazz and classical added a bit of spice to the life. So as the years passed, the redundancy of what he heard in rock was the catalyst for the migration of his musical tastes to the exclusive world of jazz. And so I'm going to invite these folks to come up here, and John and I will move off to the side over there, and we will turn the program over to them. They're pretty used to being part of the program. Would you guys want to sit down or?
I'll stand.
Okay.
That'll be fine. So to advance this over here.
It would be right here.
Okay, got it. So I have to admit that being a radio host is kind of like being in the witness protection program. People hear your voice, but they don't know what you look like. So now my cover is blown, right? But one of the things that's been hinted at tonight, and I'm going to not hint at it, I'm just going to lay it right out there, is via what happened at the Pope Hotel that we heard about earlier, and what John did with the Jazz and Blues Festival, and all the great acts that performed at Clay Space and in the Annex. Erie has pulled off some amazing things for the size of this town. We're a small market, but we punch way above our weight with what we've been able to do. And it's my pleasure to say that WQLN is in that same ballpark, and that WQLN has had jazz programming for over 52 years, which is nearly half of the history of the entire jazz idiom. Let that sink in for a second. There's very few other stations in the country that can make that claim. So that's a really cool thing that WQLN has been so involved in jazz. But actually, jazz on radio has preceded WQLN. So in the 1960s, in the 1950s, John Dabney hosted a jazz program here in Erie, and he has the distinction of probably being the first African-American jazz DJ in Erie. So that's a pretty neat distinction. And then in the 60s, Joe DiGiorgio, who later came to QLN, and we'll get up to that in a moment, but Joe hosted a show on WRIE, we believe, and that was on Sundays from 7 until 9. And there's also recollection of a third person, Joe Passerati, and this was in the 60s, and most people that were around back then maybe not here now, so we're a little unclear on that, exactly when that was, but there was some history of jazz radio before WQLN. So, big news in 1973, WQLN signed on, and the very first night that we were on, my colleague Rob Hoff was hosting jazz. So we've had jazz on WQLN for 52 years from day one. That's part of our mission and what we do. And at that time, WQLN had many satellite radio stations, and Rob broadcasted from Mercyhurst satellite station. And there were several others, including at Edinburgh. And at that time, in the early 70s, Dave Odessa and Aubrey Dillon, another familiar name, hosted jazz programs from that location. So in 1974, Joe DiGiorgio made the move to WQLN and started hosting his jazz program. So then everything was cruising along pretty nicely. There was some intermittent jazz on the radio on QLN. And then in 1979, Paul Brown, a name that's probably familiar to many of you, Paul Brown started hosting jazz on weekdays, and it was an afternoon program from 1 until 3. And his co-host on Tuesdays was Rob Hoff. And that was my favorite time to listen on Tuesday afternoons, because Rob always brought some exciting music to the mix. So that went on for a number of years. As I said, that was an afternoon program with Paul and Rob co-hosting occasionally. Then in the 1980s, things started to change. So in 1982 through 1984, a number of volunteer hosts started coming on board. And there we go. So a number of volunteer hosts started coming on board, and they included Al Lubajeski, who was hosting on Friday nights, John Ciccona had Mondays, Michael Plasha, Pete Mailer, Sheldon Peterson, Bob Francisconi, Larry Kanacki, Vic Babashko, Kirk Steeler, Marcel Yonkin, Gary Finney, and Rob Hoff. So there we all are. That's the back of a program guide from 1985. And that's the, looks like something that might be on a milk carton, right? Or something in a post office even. But there we all are. And that, and then later in 1985, after this was taken, that was in the summer, I believe. And later in 1985, then Bill Gartz started hosting Saturday Swing Session. And of all times, that was a Saturday morning program. So he continued that until 2013, but the time frame had shifted a bit. Well, this worked pretty well. And one of the things that when you listen to Rob's program, he always mentions every night without fail is that we take pride in the diversity of the jazz that we have at WQLN, all different stylistic venues of the jazz, it's all covered in one program or another. But in 1988, that diversity caused a little bit of a problem in that if you look at that list, there's more than 7 people, and there's only 7 days in a week. So we were diverse to the point where some people were only on once a week, once a month. So when listeners would tune in on a Wednesday, they never knew who was going to be on because is it this guy, is it that guy? And I don't like his, but I like the other one. So we needed to tighten things up, get a little more consistency in the programming. So in April of '88, there was a big shakeup, and the station considered modifications in that programming philosophy, and most of the volunteer hosts were dismissed and thanked for their loyal service. So Rob Hoff continued to air jazz at that time. Gary Finney shifted over from generic jazz to hosting a program on Friday nights called Ear Candy, which was a smooth jazz program. And Joe DiGiorgio continued hosting on Sundays. And to make up for that slack, Paul Brown came back, and he hosted all that jazz from 1988 until 1999. In 1990, things are still chugging along, but in November of that year, Gary Finney decided to depart the station. Aubrey Dillon came on in the early 90s, shortly thereafter, and he was hosting a program on Saturday from 10 until midnight. Stan Bielamzi was also hosting a jazz program on Friday nights, which was followed by Al Lubijeski's blues program. And Al and Jason Gibbs developed the blues programming, and Al's program began in '95, and then his Jazz Ballads and Blues first aired around 1990 until about '95, and that was on Saturday nights from 10 until midnight, and it preceded Aubrey Dillon's Lush Life, which ran from midnight until 2 in the morning. And then afterwards, Al's program began again on Sunday nights in 2006, and Al hosted Joe's program for about 6 months while Joe was on medical leave, because we know that Joe was having some issues that eventually cost him very dearly. Bill Gartz was still hosting Saturday Swing Session, but that, as I mentioned earlier, that had moved from Saturday mornings to Saturday evenings from 8 until 10, and Joe was still hosting Joe from 7 to 9 on Sundays. Rob Hoff moved to Sundays at this time frame, and he was on from 9 until midnight with a new name program called Jazz and Beyond. So it was much similar to what Rob is doing now, that there were things beyond the jazz idiom that Rob felt tied in very, very well, and of course they did. And so that was going on at that point. In the 2000s, boy, we're in the new millennium, and in January of 2005, Rob began hosting JazzFlight. So now he moved from Sundays to weekdays, Monday through Thursday, and he was on from 9 until 10. Then a year later, in 2006, Rob's program was extended from 9 till 11, 4 nights per week. And then in 2006, Joe's DiGiorgio's health issues caught up with him. And sadly, Joe passed away after hosting jazz for 32 years on WQLN, which is really quite the accomplishment. So in June of 2006, Al Lubijeski moved to Sundays, taking Joe's time slot from 7 to 9, and continued Joe's excellent approach to mainstream jazz. And at that point, in 2006, Bob Protzman came on board, and Bob had some history being from Erie area, and he had been in Minnesota, Twin Cities. Yeah, and he wrote for Downbeat magazine. He participated. I mean, you can look back at old issues of Downbeat, and many reviews were written by Bob Protzman. So he had a lot of history. So it was welcome to have Bob join the team, and he followed Jazz Ballads and Blues on Sunday nights. In February of 2009, another big change. Bob decided to jump ship and go to Mercyhurst's station that Mike Leal was running at the time. So that left an opening on Sunday nights that needed to be filled, and that was a 3-hour slot. So it was at that time that Kathy Woodard was brought on for the jazz cruise, so it was returned to the smooth jazz format. Phil Atterbury took over that first hour on Sunday nights, and sandwiched in between, Gary Finney had a new program called The Third Set. So now we're into the 2010s, just around the corner from our history here. And in 2012, things changed again on Sunday night. The third set moved from Sunday to weeknights following JazzFlight. So now Gary Finney's program was an hour long from 11 until midnight. And then 11 until midnight. And then in September of 13, Bill Garth passed away. And so Phil Atterbury left Sunday nights and took over that position on Saturday nights. So Saturday swing session, pardon me, I've got rented lips. My regular lips are in the shop being repaired. Started hosting the Saturday swing session. So that left more time on Sunday nights, so Kathy Woodard's program, the smooth jazz program, extended to 2 hours on Sunday. So in the 2020s, we're still humming along. We still have diversity, but it's not quite as chaotic as it was back in the 80s. You can tune in on a Sunday night and you know that you're going to hear the same kind of music every Sunday night. Tune in on Fridays or any other weeknight, and it's going to be pretty much the same. So things are pretty consistent, and we seem to be pretty happy with that. So it's worth mentioning again, 52 years of jazz on WQLN, and the first instrumental jazz recording that was ever released was the Dixie Jazz Band One Step by the original Dixie Jazzland Band. And that was recorded in 1917, which was 108 years ago. So that's the beginning of jazz. So 108 years, we've been around for 52 years. That's a good chunk of the history that we've been able to cover. So just to recap, Monday through Thursday, we have JazzFlight in the third set. Friday is Boppin' the Blues. Saturday is Saturday Swing Session, and then followed by Lush Life. And then on Sundays, we have Jazz Happening Now, which is a syndicated program, and then Al follows up with Jazz Ballads and Blues after that. So it's been a pretty fun ride, and I personally want to thank all of you for tuning in however often as you do. Now I'll turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Rob Hoff.
Thank you, Gary. So I want to be able to make sure that we have a time for some interaction with all of you, some discussion. So I'm going to be fairly succinct in what I might say, but I do want to make 5 major points. And I'll be as brief as I can. So the first is that I think that Erie is a jazz town. I didn't think so when I first arrived. Having come from New York City and the Twin Cities in Minnesota, I thought that Erie was pretty much maybe a country music town. Didn't really know. So this is, I'm coming to Erie in the fall of 1969, and it very quickly occurred to me, I found out, that Erie was, in fact, a jazz town. I started to teach at Mercyhurst College in September of 1969, and during that very first term at Mercyhurst, they brought in the Gary Burton Quartet. So Gary Burton was performing at the Little Theater at Mercyhurst, and I'm kind of blown away. And it turns out that there were a lot of people at that concert that I interacted with afterwards who had a strong interest in jazz, and one of the individuals told me, "You got to meet John Vanco." And I did. So John was one of the first people that I made contact with after I came to Erie, who was not associated with Mercyhurst College, and I found out that John was quite knowledgeable about jazz, and I knew we had a big connection there. And of course, John told you his story, and so I won't repeat any of that. But I began to feel Erie is really quite quite a jazz town. And I was very happy with that because I thought I'd have to be making pilgrimages to New York or Cleveland or Pittsburgh or Buffalo in order to hear some music. So, but the other thing is that I found out that Erie, as a jazz town, has many really extraordinarily talented performers, including Mary Alice Brown, who we heard performed at the Pope Hotel. And of course, Mary is legendary, and she passed 2 years ago. But so we learned about Mary Alice Brown. But there were many other, let's say, jazz legends who are part of the jazz performing community here in Erie. So I was very happy with that. And many of those jazz performers were also jazz educators. I'm thinking, for example, of Basil Ronzitti and others like that, Jim Madden, people who teach the music, Alan Zurcher, okay? People who kind of cross boundaries there. They perform and they educate. People who are promoters of the music. Tony Stefanelli, for example. Steve Drohosky, very much involved now with PACA. Rick Lopez, who brought in some really wonderful performers. Mary Halverson, William Parker, Daniel Carter. These are extraordinary talents, and they came because Rick became as well known to those performers as John Vanco was. You go to New York City and you talk to people at the Vanguard during a break or something, and you mention something, I'm from Erie, and they say, oh, you must know John Vanco. Well, it's the same thing with Rick Lopez now. So it's just, we've got people who have an international reputation, which is just extraordinary. Erie is a jazz town, okay? In addition to that, we have broadcasters, which we just heard outlined, including some of the people who were here presenting jazz on the radio prior to QLN coming on board. And then all the venues, I'm thinking about all the places that jazz had been performed at. We heard about Rainbow Gardens, Waldameer, but also the Pope Hotel, certainly, and Jethro's, which I don't think was mentioned, but Jethro's had jazz, Chesterfield Lounge, other places, Clay Space, of course, the Erie Art Museum, the Annex, PACA, Romulo's, the wonderful series that Tony Stefanelli had at Romulo's Chocolates, the summer series. We'd go there for free, and we hear some great musicians, out there, have some gelato and listen to some great jazz. The Unitarian Universalist Society, a great venue for hearing jazz, a very intimate, good acoustic space. Universities, performers like Eric Alexander, Tony Monaco, Mike Ladon playing at Gannon, other musicians playing at Mercyhurst, the Walker Recital Hall, or the Mercyhurst Performing Arts Center, the Mingus Big Band at Mercyhurst, the Wynton Marsalis Band at Mercyhurst, okay? In addition to people like Eric Friedlander, a bit more outside music. The library at the Blasco Library as a performing venue. So, for example, some of you might have been at the James Brandon Lewis Quartet when he performed at the Blasco a couple of years ago. James Brandon Lewis, Jazz Artist of the Year, according to next month's Downbeat Magazine's Critics Poll, was in Erie. Also the #1 tenor saxophonist, according to the jazz critics, performed in Erie. Erie is a jazz town. We've got a reputation, and that reputation is being extended by people like Steve Drohosky, who brings a lot of wonderful performers to PACA. Okay, so and there's also Scully's and the Docksider and Smugglers and Scotty's Cigar Bar, lots of different places where jazz has been performed. So that would be my first major point. And that also kind of connects with the fact that Erie as a jazz town has this wonderful festival, the Blues and Jazz Festival, and we've heard all about that. Okay, so I encourage you to take advantage of that August 2nd and 3rd. And the fact that QLN is connected with the festival makes it all the more special, I think. So that's my first point, Erie is a jazz town. Second point is that jazz as an art form and radio as a broadcasting medium grew up together. Gary kind of hinted at that already. So we've got jazz beginning, recorded jazz beginning in 1917 in New Orleans, Chicago, okay? So really coming into its own during the 1920s. Radio, KDKA in Pittsburgh, on the air November 2nd, 1920, the first major radio station. And they did an announcement of who won the presidential campaign their first night on the air, and that was Warren G. Harding. Okay, so that's the news. So KDKA was not a music station. It was basically a news station, and they presented some sports, like they might cover a Pittsburgh Pirates game, things like that. Okay. And then there was another station in Detroit that was founded at about the same time, 1920. But then there was this explosion of new radios throughout the country, hundreds of radios during the 1920s, including one in Erie. I think the first Erie radio station was WLEU, 1929. It wasn't on a music station, but it was news and sports and weather. Okay. So 1920s, not a lot of music on the radio, but the 1930s changed that. So 1930s, we're now into the Great Depression, and people are going to need some relief from that. And they don't have enough bread to go to the clubs for, to hear the music live anymore, but they have radios. You might have had a home radio. By the end of the 1930s, most homes had a radio. And what are you listening to on the radio? Listening to music. So you've got hundreds of radio stations now, and you're hearing music. What kind of music are you going to hear in the 1930s? Not a lot at the beginning of the 1930s, but by the time you get to the end of the 1930s, who are you hearing? You're hearing Duke Ellington, Count Basie. You're hearing Benny Goodman. You're hearing the Dorsey Brothers. You're hearing Billie Holiday. Okay, so music is on the radio. So there you've got this communication, a way of informing people about this great music, America's classical music, as they say, occurring on the radio. Just get a radio, and you can hear all of this now. I've got some other notes on all of this, but you get the idea. The jukebox came in as a technology, right? Jukebox. Now you can be an agent of your own discovery. You can go to a jukebox, punch in the numbers, and hear your favorite tunes, okay? So there you've got some ability to control what you're going to hear, okay? So that's all happening in the 30s, the 40s, and beyond. There was no real golden age of jazz radio, but we might say, if we wanted to approximate one, it probably would begin mid-1930s to maybe the early 1950s. By the time you get through the swing era and the big band era, and you start getting into bebop, you're getting into music that's more for listening than dancing to. And so that kind of changed things. And it was hard for commercial radio stations to really get advertising to pick up the bill for shows if you're playing Charlie Parker or Dizzy Gillespie, Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell. Okay, you get the idea. So the music is becoming more complex, but the second major point I wanted to make is that radio and jazz really grew up together, okay? Beginning in the 1920s, going right through to the present. Jazz is continually evolving. Radio is continually evolving as well. And we've got HD now, HD1, HD2, HD3. So here you need a special receiver to receive HD, but a lot of jazz radio stations are using multiple formats. So they might simulcast something on their mainstream radio, terrestrial, but they might also be having HD. So you go to, for example, a station like, there's a station in Orlando, Florida, WUCF, University of Central Florida. It's an NPR station. They mainstream jazz 24/7. It's an all jazz station. Mainstream it which you can get on your FM receiver, but they also simulcast the Latin jazz part of it. So you can hear the Latin jazz as you're, listening to really high quality audio. Okay. Gary covered the history of jazz at QLN radio very comprehensively, so I won't need to repeat any of that. So thank you, Gary. So that was my third point, actually, that WQLN has done exactly what Gary suggested, namely has presented jazz to this community and to the world, obviously, for 52 years and going. How long will he keep going? We might find out later tonight. I don't know. We'll see. So, fourth point, jazz is still alive. A lot of people say, jazz, isn't that old folks music? Actually, jazz is not only alive, but is thriving. And there's evidence that the audience for jazz is not only the folks who might be in their 30s or 40s or older, but even younger people. So there is this generational thing. You've heard about the lost generation or the great generation, or more recently, the Generation X or the millennials or Generation Z. So Generation Z, here we're talking about people who were probably born between the time of, let's say, 1997 to maybe 2011. So these are people who are probably 14 to 28 years old. Just call them early 20s. They're in their early 20s, okay? Generation Z, Gen Z, early 20s. What are they listening to? Well, they're listening to what you would expect. They're listening to hip hop and rap and pop, but they're also listening to jazz. There's something about, especially what has been termed vintage jazz, that appeals to the Gen Z listener. Now, this is music that might be familiar to you. You might know the name Samara Joy. So Samara Joy is a vocalist, jazz vocalist. She's a Gen Z person herself. By the way, my 3 granddaughters are all Gen Z. And they're all interested in all kinds of music. But Samara Joy would be appealing to Gen Z listeners. It's comforting, it's familiar, and yet there's something a little bit different. There's some modern elements to what she's doing that other singers might not be doing. There's another singer you may have heard of, Leifey. Is that name familiar to you? Leifey is originally from Iceland. She's a Gen Z person herself. And she's now living in Los Angeles, but she is, I think, the most widely streamed jazz artist, period. She's a Gen Z person, a singer, a composer, who has a great following, a big following. She's going to be at Chautauqua August 2nd. But of course, you're going to be going to the Erie Blues and Jazz Festival on March 2nd. She might just have to come here, right? So anyhow, Leifey, she's somebody who's getting a lot of attention these days. In fact, the new executive director for the Erie Philharmonic, my day gig, Bobby Pape, is going to that Leifey concert. And I said, Bobby, we've got a festival here. So I'm going the 3rd, August 3rd. Okay, I'll excuse you for this. All right, so I'm into the fourth point here, and that is that jazz is not dead. And there's a lot of stuff I could dig into on that, but I'm not going to drill down on that except to reinforce, confirm the notion that there's a lot of reason to believe that jazz is alive and well and thriving, and there's a new generation coming up, now in their 20s, early 20s. Greta Thunberg from Sweden, the climate activist, she's a Gen Z person. She was born in 2003. She's 22 years old, perfect Generation Z. I don't know what she listens to, but anyhow, she's Gen Z. So if you wanted a picture of somebody who might be a Gen Z person. So anyhow, jazz, live and well, and we're right here. And it's becoming more diverse and more exciting than ever. I mean, I've been following this music for a long time. I mean, I was a kid going to the concerts when I could get to them, and I think jazz is not to, I can't say it's better than ever. It's different, and in many respects, it's more exciting. And one of the things that appeals to Gen Z listeners about this music is that they're kind of genre agnostic. They don't care about labels. They're looking for blends. Okay, so an opportunity to, for example, combine something like a jazz vocal with something that sounds more like house music or EDM, if you know that language, that appeals to them. Or there's a performer from the UK, his name is Berlioz, not Hector Berlioz, not the French composer, but all lowercase, you got to check this guy out, Berlioz, with a lowercase b, Berlioz. And he's developing a style of music that is very accessible. The Gen Z people would say it's very relatable, okay? Because it's easy to listen to, but it's not ambient, it's not elevator music, but it's interesting, okay? And he's got, for example, a recording that has a track called Jazz is for Ordinary People. He's regarded as a jazz performer. There are other people, by the way, who are presenting jazz music. Maybe you know Ezra Collective. They are a jazz group, a quintet from the UK. Or there's Butcher Brown, okay, from Virginia. They're also kind of a quintet that does stuff that might be considered jazz. So there are some groups that may not be as familiar to you. So the Gen Z people, they're not listening to Dexter Gordon. They're not listening to Herbie Hancock. They're not listening to Mary Halvorson, certainly. But the thing is, they're open to this. And the music that they're listening to is kind of a gateway that allows them into a world that they might not have paid attention to because they might be listening just to, hip hop, rap, whatever. Now they're listening to jazz. And by the way, the people that I'm mentioning here are in the latest issue of Downbeat, the August issue, as rising stars. Rising stars. Okay, so this group of rising stars. So you're listening to this music, and now you're curious about, well, what did they listen to? Okay, and it turns out that people like Samara Joy are listening to people or were taught by people like Barry Harris, okay? And that's going to open up your whole world for you about, bop piano, okay? So once you've got your ears open to a new style of music, let's call it, genre-less fusion, Lefe music, it's kind of jazz adjacent. And once you're into that, it's going to get you into other things. It's kind of like you get your interest sparked a bit. You say, I want to try out something else, okay? And so pretty soon, they're going to be getting Sonny Rollins, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, maybe Eric Dolphy, who knows? So I'm very optimistic about the future of jazz. That was my fourth point. Finally, I had one more, and that is that radio listeners are now able to listen to anything, anytime they want. It used to be, if you had a record collection, and maybe you had, let's say, 500 LPs, and then maybe 500 CDs, people would say, wow, that's awesome. You've got 1,000 recordings? Well, the game has changed because now we have streaming. Now we have all kinds of opportunities to hear almost anything we want at any time we want. All you need is a cell phone, and you've got Pandora or Spotify or Amazon Music or iTunes, and you want to hear some Dexter Gordon, you want to hear Cheesecake from Dexter Gordon's album Go, or something from his album Army and in Paris, you've got it on your phone. Just listen to it, okay? You could pick it up. You got a subscription to some of the streaming services. You know, what you would pay for a CD, now you've got streaming for a month. For one CD, now you can have access to millions, no exaggeration, of recordings. Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music have libraries of let's say, I think Amazon Music, last time I saw a figure on this, was 80 million songs. 80 million songs through Amazon Music. Pretty close to that would be Spotify, Pandora right up next to it, okay? Which means that there's now really an infinite library of music for you to listen to anytime you want, anywhere you want. It's all available to you. So what does that mean for us as jazz broadcasters? What does that mean for Gary and me and Al and Aubrey? What does that mean? What can we offer you? Because you can listen to whatever you want, when you want it. You know, Gary talked about the whole history of jazz on WQLN and how there was that 1988 issue that led to changes in what was being done. And that was in part because we were thinking there's too much diversity. Well, diversity is like, okay, you listen to my program, you're going to hear something different than if you listen to Al's program. It's all good stuff, but it's different. And some people who like, you know, a certain kind of music is going to gravitate to that. You like, you know, the blues, the gospel, Hammond B3. I know who you're going to listen to, okay? It ain't going to be me, okay? But if you want to listen to something like Mary Halverson, okay, or James Brandon Lewis, we're your guys, okay? So the thing, but is that a good thing? Because you can listen to that on your phone anytime you want. So the question is, what's the future here? Because part of our agenda here for this evening is the future of jazz, imagining the future. So now we've got to think about this. If you can have access to anything you want, anytime you want, why should you turn on the radio? So I mentioned WUCF in Orlando. They had a format in which they had a variety of individual DJs. So let's suppose they've got, 8, 10 different DJs, each with a certain time slot, a certain day. And their numbers were kind of down. It's a public radio station, okay? Their numbers were listenership was kind of stagnant. Donors were kind of stagnant. And they're thinking, you know what? We've got this guy who's presenting big band music, and she's playing outside music, and he's doing, Spanish stuff. You never know what you're going to get. Your car drive. A lot of people listen to the radio on the car. The average listening time for most people to the radio is about 3 to 6 hours a week, and often it's in the car. So who's in the car when you're driving? So I'm thinking that maybe we need to go with what WUCF did, and that is to develop a new format, not having every jazz DJ do whatever he or she wants to do, but having a format that's called CRG. And CRG means you've got current releases, C, and you've got recurrent releases, things that used to be current but now are not so fresh anymore. That's the R. And you've got G, which is gold. You've got classics. And every hour, the program director at this station says, you've got to play this piece during the hour, and this other piece during the hour, and this other piece during the hour. So basically, the program director is telling the DJs, this is what you want to do. And basically, we'll script the entire day, the total 24 hours. And the 24 hours are all scripted. And it's like X percentages from current releases, another X percentages from recurrent releases, and another percentages from the classics, gold, okay? And it's all, so what you're listening to on the radio is prescribed. You're told what to play. For the listener, though, it's all going to be fresh because they're not listening to everything all the time, and they don't know what they're going to get. But the thing is that the program directors are chosen to, or the program director is to select the very best of the new stuff. That's a judgment call, I know. And the very best of the old stuff. So you're always going to be hearing the highest quality music, okay, that might be published in the critics poll, maybe published in the readers poll of magazines like Downbeat, but it's considered to be primo stuff, okay, during every clock hour, okay, this percentage. So the idea is that for the listener, you know what you're going to get. You're going to be getting high quality music, and it's going to be on whenever you listen to it. What does the host do? You don't just spin the record. It's not just about spins. It's about spending your time learning about that music. You know, I'm going to be playing, you know, this piece of Miles Davis from Kind of Blue. I want to really get into that and tell my listeners something that they might not have known about this classic piece of music. Okay, I want to do some research on this, and I want to maybe do some social media stuff on this, and we'll do some web design stuff with that, whatever that might do. So basically, the role of the jazz host, the on-air host, has changed, and as Tim pointed out, when things change, you've got to move with it. As Miles Davis and other jazz people say, the whole aesthetic of jazz, you don't look back, you look forward. We cannot continue to do what we're doing because the landscape is changing. We've got a whole new generation coming up. We got to be hip to them. And maybe start learning about Ezra Collective and Lefay and all the rest. That was my fifth point. All right.
This is excellent. And I just met these folks tonight, but I've listened to them for decades now, right? And so I just thank you both for providing that perspective. And we might have, I think we're running up against the time limit. Okay, we'll do two questions. If anybody has a question, there's a microphone. Any questions in the group?
Hello, it's on? Okay. You mentioned these new Gen Z musicians coming out, and you seem to indicate that the ones you started listing off, a lot of them are from Europe. Are we seeing a change of new music more coming from over there than where jazz originated in America? Or are there some other, besides Samaya Joy, are there others that you think should be recognized as coming up now?
You know, I'll be very blunt about this. I am not that familiar with some of the people that I do know Samara Joy's music very well, but I don't know the others. So I've got homework to do to answer that question properly. So join me at the bar afterwards and we'll discuss.
Hi, this was really interesting. And I have two questions, but I'll make them short. Tanya, the first one is to you. The Pope Hotel, that history, when the big name entertainers stopped coming because people couldn't afford to see them, what happened to the Pope Hotel? Did it decline? Did it change? What happened, or what became of it?
They had problems getting the big name act in, so it went more towards local and smaller acts for a while. But I think it was, John, you know when it closed for sure? Because I want to say 1970s.
Oh.
Is
Is the building still there? Because it's the 13th in French, it said. It was, okay.
Yeah, I was going to say 77, but I wasn't sure.
I hope you write the book, because I think that would be really interesting Erie history. But John, my next question was for you. The almost 60 years when you came and developed the art museum, it was only 60 years, but it seems like that's a saga. There are like 4 different things that it morphed into. Are you going to write a book about that? Because that would be really important history. That would be lost otherwise.
Don't hold your breath. I think about recording some of my recollections because writing them down and editing them and so forth just doesn't have a lot of appeal to me these days. That's very possible. I'll work on it.
Any other questions? Okay, one more.
We'll do one more question.
Most of us know what the government has decided. These two and others will no longer be on the air. WQLN, and I'm hoping either Gary or Rob will address what has happened, because for those of us that are sustainers of WQLN, we're pissed.
Early this morning, the Senate passed H.R. 4, which is the Rescission Act of 2025, and they passed it by a vote of 51 to 48. So now it moves back to the House for consideration, given the fact that the Senate modified the bill that was sent to them by the House. That vote will probably happen late tonight or very in early hours of tomorrow morning. While we deeply appreciate the thousands of loyal WQLN members and financial supporters, this funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting accounts for 40% of our budget, or to put that in real numbers, $1.2 million a year. It's irreplaceable, and it presents serious challenges for our station. Losing this CPB support means that we'll have to make some very tough decisions in the coming month that will affect the levels of service that we're able to provide. Our team is working diligently to find creative solutions so that many of our services can continue to reach those who need them the most, including community connections, quality programming, public safety, and educational outreach. Dark days.
Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Let's give one more round of applause for tonight's panel.